Hello and welcome to this week's Google Maps Developers Live. This week we're doing a continuation of our last week's show, which was a tale of 245,000 points. What we did is we took a very interesting data set, the CLIWOC data set. I'll bring it up on the computer in a little bit. It's actually a database of ship voyages between 1750 and 1850. We took that data, visualized the data on a map. What they did is they took the university did is they took the ship logs, they digitized it. So we have a bunch of samples of basically wind speed, and ship positions. So in the examples that I gave last week, I did not use the wind speed, but Brendan did in his canvas layer demo. This week I'm just going to go back to kind of the geospatial data though, and not the wind speed. But I'm going to cover a few more interesting visualizations that you can do with that data. So to kick things off with, I'll kind of pick up where we left off last week. So this is a heat map of actually just 1 year of the data. So basically took the points from the data set, binned them by year, and actually plotted them in a heat map. So this is actually showing density of samples, but which actually correlates roughly to actually ship voyages. So or density of ship activity. So, I mean, a lot of it's dependent on kind of where the ships were and how often they were sampling. You can see, like, if we zoom in over here, you can see that these ships in this section here were sampling relatively regularly. Some other areas, if you zoom out, you can see it's much less regular. So, don't have a good example here, but so like I said, I binned this data by year. So and I added the slider in, so actually we can kind of increment over the years. So so now we're going into 1760s, 1780s. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking each of the bins, applying them to a heat map, and applying that heat map to the actual map itself. Very interesting data here, though. So as we go year by year, we can see the densities changing over time. We can kind of see more. Actually, if we go back just a year, really interesting. We can see quite a few voyages to Peru in 1778. We can continue on. We start to see some Arctic voyages coming out of, I believe that's the Denmark. So very interesting data set. Visualizing a heat map, you get the sense of density. Also, what I talked about last week was actually how to get your map in a state where you can actually do really kind of compelling visualizations. And again, what I did with this map is I basically turned everything off using the Styled Maps API and just incrementally added in the data that I really wanted on the display. So for example, I added back in water, and I made it black, turned on the labels for water, turned on the labels for the land masses or the countries. And what I did more recently, since last week, is I actually put in the cities as well, because it's kind of interesting to see where these voyages were coming from and going. So take a look at the code again for this one here. So this was heat map 4, relatively straightforward. You can see my map styling again. So turn everything off, which is the important part, I think, with doing visualizations, because then you can kind of pick and choose what information you want to put back in. Making the water black, turning the visibility back on. So with the water labels, so you can see down here, if we look at the administrative labels, so that's the country and locality for the countries and the cities. I turned them back on, but I just inverted the lightness. It's just kind of a trick because previously they were black or white on black, and I think I inverted them to black on white. The water labels were different; they have blue in them, so I couldn't just invert the lightness, so I actually had to change the color. So that's with the map styling. Again, if you want to do map styling, I recommend definitely looking at the Styled Maps wizard, because this, tweaking a map to this level can take a little bit of effort. But using the Styled Maps wizard is just a matter of like grabbing sliders and checking checkboxes. So you can pretty quickly get a nice design. Basically, just taking the data, getting it in a format that I liked. Like I said, it was binned by year. And then here I'm setting up the gradient. This is a very, very simple gradient for a heat map. I kind of like this really kind of hot look. The red kind of sticks out really nicely on the black water background. And here just adding it to the heat map. So I talked a little bit about this last week. If you kind of want to know a little more about these parameters, things like radius and opacity and max intensity, check out the show last week. But this week we want to move on to some other cool stuff. So one more heat map though. One thing we did that we didn't show last week with the heat maps is to show what you can do actually plotting data real time on a heat map. Because the heat map itself takes an MVC array for data points. And that MVC array, the way it works is as you add points to an MVC array, the container is actually notified that there's been a change in the array. You can assign just a normal array to a heat map, but if you do that, you don't get this kind of dynamic adding removing points effect. So taking a look at this map, it's really kind of fun because you can actually see the voyages. Essentially, what I did with this map is I just sorted the data by the date and just plotting one point at a time. This is actually plotting it as fast as you can on this computer. You can see there's a little bit of a, maybe about a quarter second delay or so as each point is added in, and that's actually all rendering time. So this isn't super performant kind of visualization. But the really nice thing about it is even though we're zooming around or zooming or we're actually scrolling around, actually this is still being rendered. So it's a really cool effect that you can do on top of a map. I thought about some other things. So at some point this actually gets pretty slow because you get so many points on the map, and the heat map gets so complex that it slows down almost to a crawl. But you can do things. A really interesting thing that I've been meaning to play around with is you could potentially, like, since we're using this MVC array, you can remove points from the heat map as well as adding them. So you can actually trim down and maybe do like a window of a year or something to that effect. Another thing you can do is you could actually fade in and out points because heat map points actually have a weight associated with them. So default weight is 1, but you can actually take that down to 0, so actually make the point relatively transparent. So that would be a nice effect for kind of fading data in and out of the map as kind of the time progresses. Maybe in a couple weeks we'll kind of play around with that a little bit more. But the interesting thing about this is, so using this type of this real-time kind of rendering the points, you can actually see these voyages progress over time. So we started thinking, well, what are other ways that we can look at how these voyages progress over time? And that led us to polylines and symbols. So polylines are, have been in the Maps API for quite a few years. Very simple thing to use. You just basically provide the lat long values. You provide the styling for the polyline, and it plots them on the map. Or you can plot the polylines on the map. You can plot a number of different polylines on a map. You can do. I think in this case, I'm plotting at one point up to 25,000. We'll show that in a little bit. But what's new about this, new about polylines, is we recently added symbols to polylines. So symbols are actually SVG paths. So they're basically a custom icon that you can apply, you can put on top of a polyline. And what we did here, the arrow is kind of a little bit small. We could maybe potentially blow it up to make this visualization a little better. But you can see there's little arrows plotted on this voyage. These arrows kind of show direction because we originally just plotted this line on the map and said, wow, it's kind of an interesting voyage. We can see I think this is probably a Dutch voyage because it actually goes to Japan. But you can see it actually has 3 voyages. It goes to Japan, back, and I think to Jakarta and back again. So having those arrows on there was a really nice effect to kind of show directionality. The nice thing too is you can control what these symbols look like since they are SVG paths. Arrow is kind of a default one that we provide, or kind of a one that you can use without providing an SVG path. But you can essentially put any marker you want on top of a polyline as long as you have the SVG paths for them. Take a quick look at this code. Let's see, back to Sublime. So with this is actually probably the most simple of all the visualizations. It's a whole 51 lines of code. Although we did put the data in a separate file, which made things a lot more simple. Same thing as before, initializing the map. Setting up the voyage in terms of so here we're creating the MVC array for the coordinates, and converting these lat long values, which were actually in in a Java object or JavaScript object into a Google Maps lat long object and pushing them into this MVC array. For the symbol, we just assign a path. So the path is actually one of the defaults, like I said, the forward closed arrow. And then here is actually where we're setting up the polyline itself. So we created the polyline, we defined the path. The path is actually those points that we loaded up here. And then we control kind of how we want the polyline styled. So weight, opacity. And here's actually where we're putting the symbol on top of the polyline. So so without the icon, you can actually, you know, just be just a very basic line. But here we're actually putting the symbol on top. So here I'm applying the forward closed arrow and specifying an offset of 10 pixels. So that is actually the offset from the origin of the polyline, or the first point in the polyline. So I wanted to kind of offset it a little bit to show, well, it was just kind of a nice visual tweak. And then this repeat is how often you want that symbol repeated on the polyline. Both of these can be in percents or pixels. And then here we're just assigning the polyline to the map. So so very simple getting a polyline on a map, and also like using these SVG symbols. Also very, very simple to get a good visualization that way, or add a little bit of extra data. So like I said, with this visualization, we just wanted to show the voyage and then also show direction, which was very simple to do. So the next step is the interesting thing about that visualization is you could see kind of where it was going, where the ship was going, and what direction it was going in. But you don't get really a sense of time. So another nice thing about these symbols is you can actually animate them. So here we took, actually, I should mention that both of these visualizations were done previously by Mano Marks. Mano's been playing around with these, this idea of like plotting these symbols on polylines for a while now. But you can see here we have a little ship anchor, and actually that ship anchor is following the polyline and animated over time. So we're just kind of progressing through time and you know, plotting the polyline on, or plotting the symbol at a different offset. Very, very easy to do. Let's see what happens when it gets around this little curve here. You can see actually the direction of the polyline follows, or the direction of the symbol follows the polyline. We go back to the code for that one. The symbol's one. So the trick with this one, I mean, it's very similar to the last one, except that we've applied two symbols, or two icons. So one is the arrow symbol, which we saw before, and the other one is the ship symbol. The ship symbol, we control the styling of that as well, and we have to apply a path to it. So that path is an SVG path. I'll show you that in a moment. We can control how we want that symbol styled, how it's anchored on the polyline, etc. You know, what its scale is. Again, we just apply, you know, that polyline to or that symbol to the polyline, and away we go. So the animation, what the animation does is it's actually just incrementing a count per animation frame, and then adjusting the offset incrementally. So as we count upwards, it's just changing the percentage offset. Very simple to do. This one's a whole 83 lines of code. A little bit more complexity. So if we, I was going to say, if we take a look at the symbol path, I put it in a separate file. I'm not an expert on SVG paths, so I can't really say kind of how these are constructed or how to interpret this one. But this is how you actually define these symbols. So I think Mano actually just found one on the web and downloaded it. It was freely available. You can also potentially draw these using tools, Inkscape or Adobe Illustrator. So now, where'd our ship go? All the way down in here in the, looks like it's getting closer to the Indian Ocean. So this polyline, or this symbol, will just kind of continue to follow this polyline ad infinitum. So where do we go from there? So another thing, so in that case, we were just showing a single polyline on the map. But we have, you know, all these voyages. We have like 25,000 voyages or thereabouts. We can show all of them on the map at the same time, potentially using polylines. And that's what this next visualization is. So we go back to kind of this kind of minimalistic type map where we just show the, you know, show the oceans and the land masses, and then the names of the countries and the oceans. Again, I put the slider in here, and what this slider does is I'm going voyage for voyage, so they're sorted chronologically from the departure date. I'm going voyage by voyage, plotting them on the map as a polyline. On the right-hand side here, I just put a little key because I'm going to color the polylines by the country. So Germany is red, Denmark is green, France is yellow, etc., etc., and the Netherlands is cyan, which is an important point because you'll see a lot of them later in the visualization. So let me zoom back in. So grab the slider here, and again, like I said, I'm just going to plot these voyages in one at a time. And what you can see is you can actually get a sense of density. You can also get a sense of what countries are most active for a certain time period. And you can also get a sense of kind of where these ships are coming and going from, since these are polylines. So over time, we can build a pretty nice visualization of, oops, let's get the slider back, there we go. Pretty nice visualization of, kind of the entire data set as polylines. Let's zoom back out one. So again, nice thing about these, since it's all built into the map API, these polylines are actually scaled dynamically as you zoom in and zoom out, or as you kind of move around the map. There's quite a few of these. Like I said, there's about 245,000 points, I think it's about 25,000 polylines. So very dense data set, but it ends up looking pretty nicely on a map here. A couple things I did with this, I tweaked the opacity a little bit so you can actually see polylines behind other polylines. And that's kind of a nice feature for another way of showing density, because as these polylines stack, you can actually, the lines get more dense. And also, you can actually see the other voyages behind them. Really, I mean, this visualization by itself, even without the slider, is actually pretty rich. You can see things like, like the Dutch activity, actually Dutch activity pretty much all over the world, but primarily in Jakarta in Indonesia. A lot of activity over in the Congo. I always pronounce this wrong, but Suriname and Venezuela. So a lot of activity from the Dutch up there. And so this purple is actually Spain. So a lot of activity, obviously, from Spain and South America and the South and Central America. And if we go back over to the United States, the coast of the United States, we see a lot of activity from the British and also from France. So, and when I first saw this, I saw these lines from the Dutch kind of coming into the east coast of the United States, and I was like, well, that's kind of interesting what's going on there. And as we zoomed in, you can kind of pretty quickly see that they're landing in New York, since it was at one point called New Amsterdam. So yeah, very rich, I think, data set here. You can see a lot of information. I think it looks pretty stunning, in terms of like using the different colors. I made the colors a little bit pastel to kind of make them stick out a little bit on the map. If we get over to the single voyages, they don't stick out quite as well. Over here, an easy trick for that, though, would be to adjust the opacity or kind of the width of the polylines. And we can take a quick look at the code for this guy here. So it's going to be symbols 2. So I won't get into the kind of the specifics. Actually, the hardest part about this was actually getting the slider to work. And I actually made it work in both directions, which was kind of fun. I'll show you that in a second. So really trick here was basically for each of these, I'm creating a polyline for each of the voyages and assigning the specific color. And I'm starting out with visibility false. So what I originally did is, as I was actually adjusting the slider, I was creating these polylines dynamically. That wasn't quite as performant as creating all the polylines in advance and then just actually adjusting the visibility as you move the slider. So all these polylines are actually on the map simultaneously. It's just when I actually adjust the slider is when they actually get displayed. And so again, we have these map controls. I think these are really great for actually, a lot of samples I see the map controls kind of sitting in a space on the page, next to the map. There's no reason really to do that. A lot of times you can actually put your controls right on top of the map. And yeah, so I think this kind of the main points of that one. And again, like I'm kind of proud of this one. Actually getting the slider to work in both directions. We can actually go back and adjust the visibility as we go back in time as well. A variation of this one. So I thought it was great because you can actually build this visualization over time. So you can add the polylines, dynamically over time. But I thought it would also be good to kind of see like what was happening within a certain range of time. There's not a really good HTML5 control for doing like a slider with two points or two handles. So what I did with this one is just use a standard HTML5 slider, or a range control, and did a range of polylines, from the center of from the center. So here we're starting with 1750, and as I actually slide, I'm actually rendering, I think, about 100 polylines total on each side of where the slider currently is. Zoom in to see that a little bit. It's kind of a nice lightning effect. Nice thing about this too is you can kind of see over time like what activity is like. So if we start all the way at the left-hand side, we see a lot of activity from the French and Canada. We see a little bit of Dutch activity, some continued French activity, but then at some point we see a lot of Spanish activity, then a lot of English activity, and then a lot from the Dutch coming at the end of the data set in the 1800s. So nice visualization, I think, as well, because you get this sense of kind of what's going on at a particular point of time. A variation of this would be to show like maybe all the polylines for a year, and as you drag the slider, you just show 1 year of polylines. A lot of different things you could do with this visualization, I think, just with the polylines and this data set with polylines. Like I said, a really rich data set. I mean, since you have all these points of the voyages, nice way to use them is to plot them as polylines. So let's move on. So going back to this one, so again, another way we can kind of slice this data up with polylines is so this is all the polylines again. Like if the slider was all the way to the right with the visualization, a couple of visualizations ago. But the thing I wanted to add to this one was events on polylines, because polylines can actually, using the Maps API, you can actually register events on polylines. So here what I've done is, as I mouse over, what I'm doing is I'm catching the mouse over event, and then I'm actually adjusting how the polyline is rendered. It gets a little dense in the Atlantic here, but if I go over to the Pacific, so some of these polylines I couldn't see very well before. As I mouse over them, you can see the entire voyage lights up. I changed the width and the opacity, z-index, and basically bringing it all the way to the front so you can see the entire voyage. The other thing I did is I put a click event on here. So if I click on it, I get kind of an old school JavaScript alert. Shows me the index of the voyage, the country, how many points in the polyline, and the beginning and end of the voyage, the dates. Code for this guy. So the only real difference is on that. Let's see, go back. I forget what visualization I'm on, number 4 already. Almost done. So if you take a look, the interesting points about this is these events. So I'm creating the polylines, setting the default, the defaults for the weight, opacity, and the color, and the z-index of 1. Setting everything to a z-index of 1 kind of randomizes kind of how they're displayed. If I tweaked this at one point, and I actually set the z-index to the index of the polyline, where the polyline is in the array, and basically all the most recent polylines, or the polylines that were the voyages, which were later, were actually just stacked up on top. So you basically saw the Dutch pretty much all over the place, and then all the other polylines. But by setting everybody to the same z-index, they're rendered a little more randomly. This is actually for the click listener. So you can see here I'm just using the Google Maps Events Add Listener, adding a click listener on the line, and going through creating an alert window. And here I'm actually the mouse over and mouse out. And all I'm doing is just setting the options, stroke, weight, opacity, and z-index to 999, so it's 6 up on front. And then as the mouse out, I actually revert everything back. So just about 20 lines of code to add kind of this nice interactiveness to the visualization. I put this actually in a separate method just to take advantage of the closure on the line. So So this reference to line here is actually the reference to the line within this event listener. If this code was elsewhere, things wouldn't work quite as well. So yeah, definitely when you're doing this and you want to add the event listers, it's kind of convenient to put these in a separate method. So the reference to the line is consistent. So anyway, so last visualization before we move on is symbols and markers. So those symbols that we're talking about on the polyline, so these SVG paths, they work great on polylines, but you can also use them as markers as well. Use them in the exact same way. Basically, when you set up your marker, you specify the icon, and that icon, you can control how it's rendered or what the path is, so you can use your own custom markers, SVG markers. And again, the nice thing about these SVGs is they're scalable. You can really dynamically adjust kind of how they're rendered or how they look. So what I did with this one, this visualization here, is I took the data set and I ordered everything. So for each voyage, I took the departure and the arrival, so the first and the last data point of the voyage, and I put those into an array, sorted that array, and basically capturing as I move the slider across, capturing events for a departure of a ship or an arrival of a ship. And then what that allows me to do is build a visualization where we can see like what is the relative number of ships in voyage for each of these countries. A little easier to show than to explain, but so as you can see, as I'm sliding the range to the right, I go to 1751, and these bubbles or these markers on each of these countries is kind of growing and shrinking over time. It grows as a voyage leaves for that country. It shrinks as a voyage returns or voyage completes for that country. So this is showing the relative number of ships at sea for each of these countries. As we go over time, interesting thing about this visualization, you can kind of see, like, again, what we saw with some of the other visualizations, how active the UK was. We see how active Spain becomes at some point. French activity during the late 1700s was relatively consistent until Spain really kind of took off at this point. And as we keep going, we'll see, at some point how the Dutch oh, there we go. There's another bubble coming from the UK, and then how the Dutch kind of took over the world in terms of trade in the late 1800s or mid to late 1800s. So pretty straightforward code. I actually made this one work backwards. The hardest part with this one was actually getting the data in a way that I could actually use it to create these bubbles or these markers. So if we go back, take a quick peek at the code. So here, I've set up these are the lat longs for each of the markers. So I'm using these for creating the markers, creating my map. Same stuff as before. So here I'm actually setting up the data. So I'm creating the array of events. I used a +1 for when a ship is leaving and a -1 for when a ship returns. And that's really convenient because I can just kind of add and subtract as I encounter these events in the array. And basically here, just creating these markers. I created a separate class called marker symbol. This just lets me kind of capture all these default settings in a separate JavaScript object. I could easily just have inlined this code up here in when I'm creating the marker, but a little more convenient to put it down here. And this is the code that gets a little bit hairy, where I'm actually sliding from left to right, kind of, picking the delta of, how many ships I want to add or remove from each country. So that's pretty much it for these visualizations. We're going to continue to kind of play around with these. We think they're a lot of fun. I know Brendan's actually looking at different ways you can use the canvas layer, which uses WebGL for rendering mass amounts of data. So we kind of think that these 245,000 points or 25,000 or so voyages is probably about the max you can display all at once on a map using some of the default libraries. So you could probably tweak that, and I don't think you always necessarily want to do that. So you get to the point where there's just too much information on a visualization that you can makes it a little hard. I mean, there's a lot of tricks you can use with like the the mouse over effects on the polylines that kind of sort things out. But if you do really want to go beyond that, potentially custom, render some really custom visualizations, the canvas layer using WebGL will be the way to go. Hopefully we can get Brendan back in another week or two to show off some more stuff. But he's been working hard on the wind data, because the wind data is a whole other kind of aspect of this data set, which is actually really interesting. Some other stuff, we probably continue to play around these polylines, with these animations. A really cool thing with these animations, or animating the symbols on polylines, is you potentially plot a number of ships actually leaving or animate a number of ships at any one time. If you've been to the More Than a Map site, I hope you've been there, because there's a lot of great inspiration there. Their visualization for flights actually shows a number of different planes actually en route. They're using the exact same technique as we did with the animated ship. So if you haven't checked it out, morethanamap.com, check out the demos, and it's a data visualization demo. Shows a number of points on there, or a number of symbols animated at one time. So that's pretty much it. A couple quick announcements. So in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be down in the Maps Developer Relations team, or some of us will be down in Sydney. And we're hoping to do next week a Places API event, GDL event, where we kind of show off some new APIs that are coming out with the Places API. So if you're really interested in location data, definitely a good one. I've been working on a visualization that actually uses this data, the place data. So even if you're interested in visualizations, you'll probably want to, but not local data, you might want to check it out anyway. And a couple of weeks out, we're looking to potentially do something with the photosphere, because the photosphere app that was launched with the Jelly Bean update recently actually allows you to take 360-degree panoramic photos. Those photos are really convenient to use for the Street View API. So you can take a 360-degree panorama using just actually a fairly simple amount of code, actually render it in a website using the Street View library. So API. So that's pretty much it. So if you have any ideas, if you want to see something a little more detail on any of these visualizations, or you have any comments or questions, post them on the YouTube channel, and we'll take a look at them. And if you have any ideas for future things you'd like to see, also let us know, because we're always looking for ideas to kind of pass on. So thanks for tuning in, and hope to catch you in another week or so.